Hi, everybody. David Nour back with you for another episode of the Curve Benders live stream. Delighted you're here. We're broadcasting on LinkedIn and Facebook, YouTube, and even Twitter. Joining me is Julian Birkinshaw from the London Business School. Julian, welcome.
Thanks very much, David. Great to be with you.
It is great to have you, and I appreciate us continuing this conversation from the Curve Benders podcast that we aired earlier today. For our audience, I would encourage you to jump in with questions or comments or additional insights that might be of interest or value to you. But Julian, let's start with your background. For those that may not know as much about you and your work, can you talk a little about your focus and your efforts today?
Yeah, so I'm a professor at the London Business School, which I think most people will know is one of the top business schools in the world. I've been there for 20 odd years, variety of roles. But the heart of what I do is I teach, research, consult on how big companies are adapting to today's crazy world. And of course, sometimes that's about adapting to disruptive digital technology. Sometimes it's about just adapting to the whole COVID situation. You know, there's the whole kind of sustainability agenda, and the kind of gem of insight, which is kind of sort of started 25 years ago and carried all the way through, is this notion of big companies just becoming more like small companies in terms of their ethos, their way of working, the mindset, the attitude, if you like, that they try to get across those organizations. That's lots of people are talking about that. I just bring my own particular angle to trying to make that happen.
Love that. And you've published how many books?
I mean, I guess it's 15. I've actually stopped counting, but it's around 15. And every 2 or 3 years, there's another one just to keep me current.
So talk about the key trends you've observed, Julian, in the last year of this global pandemic that I'm really interested you believe will stay with us now that we're getting, CDC released some new guidelines. We're getting more people vaccinated. We're going to start traveling again. What do you believe are some of the trends at the enterprise level that will stay with us in the after-pandemic world?
Yeah, so obviously the pandemic, I mean, everyone knows this, the pandemic accelerated a couple of trends which were starting to happen anyway. Digitization of everything being foremost amongst them. You know, my business school, we learned how to teach online, overnight, almost literally overnight. And that's a trend which was starting but was going to take years. So trend of digitization of products and services clearly accelerated. A couple of things that are not going away, which started pre-pandemic. The sustainability agenda was pretty much at the top of the list of chief executives. I went to the Davos meeting in the World Economic Forum meeting, whenever that was, just over a year ago. That's the only thing anyone wanted to talk about pre-COVID. And now, of course, what we're seeing is every big energy company, every automobile company falling over themselves to make pledges about going to zero carbon, to electric vehicles, all of that stuff. So those twin trends towards sustainability on the one hand, towards digitization on the other, COVID, as we get through it, those two things are going to come back. Then you've got, of course, the aftermath of COVID. And of course, the particular story there now is just how much are we going to go back to ordinary, traditional kind of ways of working. And it's kind of standard now to say, well, we're not going to go all the way back. We will go some of the way back, but we can guess, for example, that people will be working sometime at home, sometime in the office. That is all true. The bit which I think we haven't yet sort of thought through the consequences of is, what does that really mean for real estate prices? What does that mean for the nature of cities? That all those ancillary services that are provided in cities on the assumption that tens of thousands of people will swarm into those cities every day and live their lives there. So I think those consequences have yet to be thought through, but it's fairly clear to me that cities are going to change fairly substantially in terms of how they work. So there's 2 or 3 trends that I think are really kind of taking shape as we speak.
Let's build on that for a second. The sustainability one. We all are in agreement that our planet is important and we may not be doing enough, but are there some underlying causes that you believe? Is it just happens to be flavor of the current times, or what's elevated sustainability to a bigger issue than it was
I
pre-pandemic?
mean, it's a pretty good question, right? Because we've known for at least 25 years, the scientists have known that global warming is a thing, if you like. The Kyoto Protocol, I think it was signed in the late 1990s. And every year, the evidence just gets stronger and stronger. But then I'm not sure quite what it is, but something changed in the last 2 or 3 years. And I suspect it was actually pressure from the capital markets. I think a lot of companies had started to really kind of take this stuff seriously. But when you start seeing big companies like BlackRock, when you start seeing the big sovereign wealth funds pledging that they will only invest in companies that are taking this stuff seriously, then suddenly that does put the chief executives of those companies into a place where they have to act. You will remember the Business Roundtable pledge made by hundreds of chief executives middle of last year. I forget exactly what it was. That was a bit of a watershed moment, because even though the consequences of that have not been played out, it was an opportunity for a lot of people with very, very influential positions to all stand behind this and say this matters. So I have mixed views on this. I absolutely do. Of course, we've got to continue to make money for our shareholders, but we've got to now do this in a way that is sustainable. And I start to see lots of evidence of companies putting real serious commitments behind doing that now.
So in our podcast, you and I talked about a lot of the startups tend to get the notoriety. They get the visibility for being innovative. And you hear about the Amazons and the Googles and Teslas. And you actually have a very different perspective that these large enterprises bring a whole lot of breadth and depth and capability and competency. Talk about, number one, I want you to reiterate your fantastic data piece.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
And then let's build on that.
Perfect. I mean, give me a couple of minutes to play it out, because the killer statistic here, which I did the analysis of this about a year ago, I had a very simple question, which was, how many of today's Fortune 500 did not exist at all 25 years ago? And I asked my students, I asked these executive groups that I speak to, and people say, oh, maybe 100, maybe 200. The answer is 16, 16, only 16 of those companies. And that is indeed Amazon, Google, Tesla, Facebook, Netflix. I mean, you know the list, but the trouble is there are only 16 of them. There is nothing else underneath. And the other 484 companies on that list are actually companies that have been around in some shape or form for at least 25 years, and actually in most cases for 40, 50, 60, 100 years. So the story that the press loves to tell is the story of David beating Goliath, of these startup companies growing quickly and killing off the old guys. And of course, they talk about Kodak and Blockbuster and Nokia. But the trouble is, there aren't too many other examples of big companies that have actually gone bust. And I just want to rebalance that conversation to say, of course, it's true that these guys are coming along and becoming very successful. But let's not forget the fact that the Goliaths, if you like, or the elephants that learn to dance, whatever metaphor you like, those companies have actually adapted incredibly effectively. It happens behind the scenes. We don't see the exciting things that Citibank and Procter & Gamble and Walmart are doing. But every year they are getting more efficient. They are buying up companies. They are building their own organic technology ventures. All of those things are actually enabling them to continue to adapt and succeed. And that's the story that we often miss.
And in that process, whether it's organic or inorganic, you also believe in many ways they're reinventing themselves and they're remaining relevant through that process.
That's right. I mean, look, you've got plenty of examples of companies that have completely reinvented, who they are. I mean, the famous old example of 3M, Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company, completely changed who it is over a century or so. I will give you, just to be provocative, I'll give you the example of Nokia. Everyone thinks of Nokia as a failure. I can make an equally compelling case that in the long term, Nokia is a success. It started out in forestry. It started out in rubber boots. It moved into telecoms. It had a period when it was really top of the list in terms of smartphones, handsets. That business failed, but Nokia has now rebounded, and Nokia is now a world leader again alongside Huawei in the infrastructure business. Nokia is a very successful company once again. And so the long-term story of Nokia is a company that's actually reinvented itself.
You would love this. I recently got a email from, I kid you not, Kodak selling ring lights for my live streaming. And I had to do a double take, like, really, not Kodak? Right?
Yeah.
Who knows more about images and imagery?
Well, that's right. Yeah.
People that invented it, and it was just so clever. And by the way, I actually bought one, right? Because
that's cool.
It was in an elegant case, and it's a tripod and a ring light. And if you travel, this thing will become really handy. So I was pleasantly surprised to see them kind of pivot like that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, just one final thought on that. I mean, it is true that Kodak's original shareholders lost all their money and the company kind of reinvented itself in the ashes. But its arch rival in that earlier period was Fuji. And Fuji actually is another great example of a company that diversified into cosmetics and pharmaceuticals and is actually still doing very well. So these reinvention stories exist.
So I want to encourage our audience to jump in. So we've got a question from Hunter. Adding to the entrepreneur topic, do you believe social influences will remain relevant for years to come?
Yeah, and social influence, meaning that the sort of people who are, tweeting and going on LinkedIn and talking about these sort of things, just to be clear.
I think we were asking about the environmental and the sustainability and those types of social kind of influences.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And so I'm going to back off the specifics of it just to be clear. I mean, there are these narratives emerging in today's world which are incredibly influential on businesses, and any large business ignores those narratives at their peril, if you see what I mean. So absolutely, and sometimes they go too far. I mean, you and I were talking before we started about the British royal family and the press taking things too far. I mean, that's a very different world. But my point is, look, we've got hugely successful, powerful media out there, sometimes paid for press, sometimes individual social influences. The individuals running the companies have no choice but to actually follow this stuff. But they've got to take a stand sometime. And sometimes one of the things I'm trying to do is to help tell an alternative narrative to help make sense of it.
So let's talk about 4 ways for these mature companies to respond. So I'm Hilton, I'm Hyatt, I'm Marriott, and I see Airbnb starting to grab legitimate market share from me. Talk about the four approaches to these enterprises responding.
Yeah, beautiful. I mean, and we'll stick with the hotel story because everyone can relate to hotels, right? So the kind of classic view, if anyone's ever read the famous Clay Christensen book, The Innovator's Dilemma, the classic view is you fight back, you take on the innovator almost on its own terms. You create a separate division doing what that competitor is doing. And I'm not saying Hilton ever did that. I don't think they did. But certainly when online news became available, what did the New York Times do? The New York Times created the .com version. So you can fight back directly. That is strategy number 1. Strategy number 2 is you double down on your existing strategy. You say, look, we accept that Airbnb is going to tackle a segment of the market. But actually, quite honestly, that's not a segment of the market that we care about. We care about the business traveler, the person who needs a very, very secure and comfortable and predictable experience. We've got a big brand. We've got a decent distribution sort of network. We will just continue to do what we've done before. And indeed, we'll do it even better than before. We'll make that experience even stronger. And hopefully, we'll keep those guys at bay. So that's the second strategy. Strategy number 3 is a sort of consolidation strategy, a retrenchment strategy, which says, look, we accept that these guys are going to succeed, but they're not going to succeed and kill us off. What we are going to have to accept is that we are going to continue to have a role, but a role alongside these guys. And so what we're going to do is we're going to cut costs. We're going to become more efficient. We're going to pull back a little bit. Maybe we're going to merge with a few of our competitors. We see an awful lot of consolidation in lots of industries these days. An awful lot of that's what I call retrenchment. And in some industries, we're going to get government help. We're going to actually get regulations put in place. We're going to do a bit of lobbying in order to keep the new guys, the insurgents, a little bit at bay. So not happening so much in the hotel industry, but actually, no, I'm going to take that back. I mean, a lot of jurisdictions have absolutely gone to cities and gone to whatever national government and said, we don't like those Airbnb guys. We think they're breaking the regulations. You should actually create rules that keep them away. So that's the third strategy, is retrenchment. And then the fourth and final strategy, you can argue that this is the kind of the last thing to do if everything else goes wrong. I call it migrating away. And migrating away says, we can see that this new insurgent is going to take a big chunk of our business, and we're pretty worried about this. But we have a portfolio. This is not our only business activity, and we are going to seed that ground. We're going to take the money off the table over there, and we're going to put it somewhere new. So this is what I just talked about with Fujifilm, saying, look, we can't compete with Instagram in digital imaging. What we can do is we can take our base chemical business and we can create a new line of cosmetics in a different place. So all these different strategies have their pros and cons. None of them is risk-free. The first two are, if you like, in American football terms, offense. The second two are defense. You kind of have to do a little bit of both of these, actually. I mean, we could absolutely debate which combination of these things is right. But to some degree, when an insurgent first arrives on the scene, chances are you're dabbling in all four of these areas. And then you have to start to choose which is the right strategy. So there you go. That was a lot of words there, but hopefully it made a little bit of sense.
Oh, it's critical. So we talk a lot about these mature organizations. Julian, what do you believe holds them back? What are the biggest drivers that holds these mature, very competent, very capable organizations back from, and I want to ask you a very specific question.
Yeah, go.
I keep thinking of an airline, right? The airline industry has gotten battered, right, over the last year because predominantly business travel and travel in general has fallen off. I can't think of anybody else who would know more about transporting people and goods than an airline industry.
Right.
What is keeping them back from thinking about air taxis? What is keeping them back from really aggressively going after, human-based drones that would transport people? I don't need a 747 to go 100 miles. But it's too far for me to drive. So what better option than my local airline?
And let's be clear. I mean, the airlines and indeed, other transport companies, I mean, they are undoubtedly kind of thinking these thoughts, right? And there's no question that somewhere pick your favorite airline, there are teams of people who are brainstorming on this stuff. So the question is never, have they thought about this? The question is, what is stopping them from actually making significant investments in these things? And the classical answer to that question is that because they are making money through a predictable revenue stream through an existing business model, they are paranoid about giving that up or allowing that to be threatened. And every aspect of the structures and processes within those companies is all geared up to perpetuating that classic business model, that existing revenue stream. So now, of course, the airlines aren't making money right now. So it doesn't completely apply to your specific example. But certainly every time we've seen one of these big companies fail, we know for sure what prevented them from taking the big, bold move was this sort of paranoia that they were going to jeopardize an existing revenue stream. And so you've got to be an Amazon or a Netflix, if you see what I mean, to have the boldness and the courage and almost like the level of control that you need to actually make the bold moves. It's not a surprise that the companies that succeed in these situations typically have one very dominant shareholder, or they're privately held, or they've got venture backing, because that gives them the ability to actually make bold decisions.
Which leads me to two follow-up questions. Do you believe these large organizations are capable of learning some of this agility, learning some of this adaptability from a Amazon. There's been, I looked it up. There's been hundreds of books written about the Amazon way. And I'm thinking, if I'm a P&L leader at a large, mature company in a mature industry, is it realistic to think that I could apply some of those Amazon approaches to kind of my environment?
Yeah. I mean, the answer is you can absolutely learn from Amazon or Google or whatever, but you've got to be very thoughtful about how you adapt them. I mean, let me just spend a minute or two on this. I think I had a thing in Harvard Business Review on this once called "Beware the Next Big Thing," and it was exactly this point. So, along comes a company with a really cool way of working, and traditional companies swarm all over it, and they try it out, and it just doesn't work for them. And the reason is pretty straightforward, right? Which is that traditional companies have built a set of practices that have taken shape over decades, if not centuries, and those things kind of fit together, and they fit together in a logical sort of way. And you can't just go along and take a look at Google and say, well, that's interesting. Google gives its engineers 20% innovation time off, free time, or whatever it is. Let's just do that, because quite clearly that is one specific practice which works within a network of all of the things that make Google successful. You can't take that one thing out and drop it into Unilever or Procter & Gamble and expect it to work. It simply will not. So my advice to these big established companies is twofold. First of all, absolutely, let's study the Amazons and the Googles of this world. Let's figure out what they're doing. And let's try to understand the underlying principles behind those practices. And then let us see if we can actually, take that principle and then apply it in a way that works for us. So, we won't give people 20% of their time off, but we will absolutely, work on the principle that everybody has got some sort of idea to do how to do things better somewhere. And we need to find a way of liberating that. And whether that's through a team, or whether that's through a bit of time off, or whether that's through some other mechanism, is for the individual company to bear in mind.
So do you believe this idea of entrepreneurship, like creating entrepreneurs inside large enterprises, is that viable? Is that realistic to take, to assume we can take people that have been with us for a number of years and have thought about the same things, and we can create entrepreneurs out of them?
So we absolutely can get them to become more entrepreneurial. Now, how far is absolutely up for grabs. And, I will often, provoke people by, saying, do we want a few Elon Musks, in our midst? And most people say, well, they don't want that because, first of all, Elon Musk wouldn't want to work in a big company. He simply couldn't do that. And secondly, these are difficult people to have around with you. So the way I like to say it is, I want people to become a little bit more unreasonableness meaning trying to change the system, but I want them to be unreasonable in a reasonable way. In other words, I want them to also think about making sure that they don't lose their jobs. And so there is a set of tactics that you can put in place as an individual to both be a little bit more entrepreneurial, pushing your ideas, but without taking huge risks. A friend of mine calls this stealth storming. It's about kind of, changing the system from within, but without taking any undue risks. And that's about staying under the radar. It's about making sure that you've got an experimental idea which you've got a bit of traction behind before you raise your head above the parapet.
So if I'm the board, if I'm in charge of stewardship of this large organization, what's my role? How do I, again, I'm not there to do, I let the management team do that. I'm there to govern. I'm there to provide or ask better questions to make sure we remain relevant as an entity.
Exactly.
What's the board's role when it comes to innovation and forward thinking and reinvention of that enterprise?
I mean, so I like to think of it as a sort of a schizophrenic or ambidextrous role. In other words, there is a looking out role and there's a looking in role. The looking out role is that you absolutely have an obligation, a responsibility to take stock of these changes. How is that set of environmental forces shaping up? How is, the world of, electric vehicles, for example, changing the energy industry and the automotive industry? You've got to have a point of view on that. Sometimes you've got to take a big, bold step in terms of this is the direction we're going. But in some ways that's the easy bit, but that's the sort of the sexy bit of it, if you see what I mean. That's the exciting bit of it. The bigger role, the kind of where the hard work has to be done, is you've got to look inwards and say, I've got 1,000 people, I've got 100,000 people in this organization. They are all keen to make things work better. I mean, most of them are. They're all feeling a little bit frustrated. They're feeling that the systems and the procedures that we've developed over the years are kind of getting us down. And my job as a board, as an executive team, is to proactively push decision-making down, to delayer the organization, to make sure that we are keeping costs down as much as possible. We can automate things where we can. Our job is to try to make sure that everybody, many, many layers from the top, actually feels that they have some opportunity to make a difference. And that's hugely difficult. That's probably the most difficult thing a senior executive in a big company has. They understand what they need to do. They can directly influence the people 1 or even 2 levels below them, but they can't actually touch the ones 3 or 4 or 5 levels down. Their job is to try to somehow create that culture, that set of structures that is enabling those tens of thousands of people to do things better. And I don't think any company, frankly, has got it quite right. I mean, Amazon, is now 1 million employees, Amazon. They haven't, I suspect the way Amazon works, I don't really know, is 90% of Amazon employees are actually working in what you might call blue-collar jobs. I mean, they're in the warehouse-type jobs, right? But the other 10%, which is still 100,000 people, are in white-collar jobs, in professional jobs where they're trying to really change things. And Amazon is working very hard to continue to have that, what they call day one atmosphere in the company, where those 100,000 or so people are actually continuing to behave as Jeff Bezos would have asked them to do 20 years ago.
So I believe for any organization to learn some lessons from this pandemic and really maneuver its capabilities, it also needs to be able to invest in or really execute what I call labor flex, right? Labor flex, right? So how do we reskill, upskill, or redeploy our talent into other areas, right? So that airline that's lost business travel, how do we shift some of those people to leisure travel, for example? Talk about the role of talent in these organizations' ability to reinvent themselves, right? So if I'm coming out of a school, I got to tell you, I'm just not that excited about being a cog in the wheel, or I'm not excited about going somewhere and working where our parents would stay for 20 plus years.
Exactly.
What do organizations have to do when it comes to talent to attract, develop, and retain that exceptional talent that's going to help reinvent us?
I mean, look, and it's a huge, huge challenge, right? Because it does get to the whole issue about how are we educating, the youth of today. And I mean, I'll come back to that maybe in the next piece. But let's just start with the organizational challenge. I mean, right now, of course, you can argue that because of the way that the labor market is, there is actually a lot of talent out there itching to get opportunities. So, depending on where the labor market is at any particular time, you've either got more or fewer good people available. But let's assume that there is a bit of a war for talent on. What do you do as an employer? And I'm going to take a couple of fairly obvious points, but what you're doing as an employer is, first of all, you need people who have shown that they understand the shall we say, the technological challenges of today. Now, that doesn't mean that they've got to be data scientists. Absolutely not. It means they've got to have the basic knowledge of the technology layer that is underpinning every company today. But much more than that, they've got to exhibit that set of qualities that will be needed in the years ahead as automation and artificial intelligence become increasingly important in the business world. And, to simplify that story enormously, I'd like to think in terms of 3 or 4 basic chunks. Number one, creativity, showing that capacity to think, outside the box and to do things which no computer could ever imagine. Secondly, we can call it empathy, which is essentially an ability to relate to your fellow human in an effective way. And that runs the gamut from, being a salesperson to being a nurse in a hospital, if you see what I mean, and indeed being somebody on a call center. And then my third chunk, I like to think of it as judgment. And what I mean by that is the ability to take stock of a situation, to weigh up a variety of different situations and criteria and parameters, and to form a rounded perspective on what needs to be done. Now, that's a classic executive role, but if you think about it, that sort of judgment is useful at multiple layers in any organization. So those are the types of skills that we need to try to inculcate in our people.
So let me jump into, Hunter has a question. So Nour, you mentioned the term Workflex. Do you believe this causes an issue for people with less experience, losing opportunities to more experienced workers willing to do the jobs temporarily? What does that do to different tenure inside organizations?
I mean, this is a huge issue, right? And I can't claim any sort of proprietary insights on this one, but we've got this, and the US obviously is different than the UK and other parts of Europe in terms of the amount of flexibility there is in the labor market. But the one absolutely kind of sort of huge sea change over the last decade or so has been the rise of what we can call the gig economy. And the gig economy is not actually exclusively a blue collar thing at all. I mean, in fact, the biggest number of gig economy workers are actually, people like ourselves, professionals who have chosen to work for themselves and to sell their services back. So I'm not quite sure exactly what the question was getting at. By all means, ask a sort of follow-up question. But for me, the challenge that companies have got to face is to get the right balance between that smaller set of people who they want to have as full-time employees, and they want to take some sort of responsibility for helping to bring those people with them, and obviously that huge group of freelancers. And certainly right now in the pandemic, the companies that have these sort of more virtual models have really benefited from that, because of course they haven't had to make layoffs. So.
I would encourage our audience to jump in with other questions of me or Julian. Early on in our conversation, you brought up sustainability and you brought up this digital transformation.
Yeah.
Where are you seeing the biggest concentration of digital transformation that Julian is actually creating real enterprise value?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, what you've got obviously is we've got digitization, the digital revolution finding its way into every aspect of business. And the bit that we see first is obviously the digital products and services that you and I buy, the streaming and the news and the Facebook stuff. And then the second thing that we see is the emergence of these new digital business models that we mentioned, the Ubers and the Airbnbs earlier. The third category, which is the bit I want to just spend a bit of time on, is the bit that we often neglect because it's less exciting, which is the digitization of back office activities, the digitization of industrial activities, the internet of everything. And if you take a big bank or if you take a big industrial company, where they're actually creating enterprise value for themselves, for the most part, is actually all of the efficiency savings they're getting out of those digital investments. I'll just give you a very specific example. The most valuable utility energy company in Europe is called Enel, E-N-E-L. It's an Italian energy company based in Rome, hugely successful. They've been a pioneer in green energy. I've spent a lot of time with them in the last couple of years looking at their digital strategy. And yes, they're dabbling in, new services for their customers, and they're dabbling in e-mobility solutions. And this stuff is maybe making them 1% of their revenues, but 99% of their revenues and all of their profits is, good old-fashioned power generation, distribution, and servicing. And they have saved a fortune by digitizing all of those activities, the digital plant, the digital services to customers. And so as I say, we don't talk about it because it's just not very exciting, because in some ways, the automation and the digitization of business has been going on for 60, 70 years now. But actually, we should remind ourselves where the real benefits are. And I do often worry that companies get too excited by the sexy new thing and actually stop thinking about where they're making money. I've just been exploring blockchain, right? The latest incarnation of blockchain, right? How is JP Morgan, for example, making money out of blockchain? Well, it's not, right? I mean, but it is dabbling in blockchain in order to understand where it might be in the future. JP Morgan makes its money out of, automating its tedious back office processes.
I read a fascinating data point that Bank of America is one of the largest patent holders of blockchain technology. And you're thinking, it doesn't get any more traditional than, a firm that's been at this for a while. So it's fascinating that they've doubled down on that. So in our conversation around enterprises reinventing themselves, you gave examples of new brands. You talked about new channels to market. You talked about these operational efficiencies. Julian, how often are you seeing business model innovation? Another friend of ours, a colleague of ours, Alex Osterwalder, and we talk about business model generation. How often are you seeing successful business model innovation come from traditional mature companies and mature industries?
Very, very seldom. I mean, that's the short answer. The longer answer is, and I don't have statistics on this, but every time I come across a cool new business model, I can with almost certainty predict that it came from either a startup, a venture-backed startup, or it came from a company kind of moving into an industry from the outside. So, iTunes was, Apple moving into the music industry. iTunes was not invented by Sony or Warner, right? So it is almost an ironclad sort of fact. I'd love your audience to find me some nice exceptions to this rule, that genuinely new business models pretty much always come from the outside. Now, Amazon continues to be an exception to this rule because Amazon, of course, has invented, a dozen business models, and you can argue that it's now a big established company. But I hate to generalize from Amazon or Apple or Google. That's really not a very fruitful activity. So I don't know if you've got any examples. I mean, I'll throw this back at you. Can you think of any really cool examples of truly successful business models coming from incumbents? And
I think several are trying. And by that I mean, there's examples, and Alex and these guys talk a lot about, traditional, for example, manufacturers who create a separate line of business that rents their equipment instead of a capital expenditure. It becomes an OpEx expenditure, right? Again, a separate, but they also have to build now maintenance teams and other parts of the organization that replaces that rented equipment. Where in the past they would just sell it and service it, right? So they talk about that, but I tend to agree with you. I think it's, and I would welcome your comment on this. My supposition is the metrics and the compensation that many business leaders, that P&L leaders measured by, is not conducive to a new business model innovation. I'm penalized if I go explore and experiment a new way to go to market.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, there's a risk of it not working out. There's a risk that even if it does work out, what I'm doing is I am indeed, cannibalizing an existing revenue stream. And so we've got plenty of examples of big traditional companies that have transformed themselves, as we talked about. You can talk about Adobe, you can talk about National Geographic. There's this Danish company called Orsted, but that's not quite the same thing as coming up with a first to the world business model which disrupts the mainstream thing. And your assertion is spot on. I mean, all of the incentives and structures in big companies continue to make this difficult. And I'm not unhappy about that. In other words, I think big companies are actually usually right to say, let's kind of wait to see what happens, because most of the time, these disruptive things take many, many years to play out. I mean, if you just take the pharmaceutical and biotech industry, that is a story which has now had 30 years run. I mean, biotech started out as a late 80s thing, and frankly, it took until 2010 before it really took off. So my point is, if you are Pfizer or Merck or whatever, you actually had time to take stock of that, to see how biotech was going to play out, and then buy your way in later without worrying about it killing you off.
So one of the comments from a LinkedIn user is many companies are not considering business model transformation, but are building digital platforms. Is that their approach to remaining relevant?
Yeah. So, I mean, building a digital platform, let's be clear what exactly we mean by that. So, what is a platform? I mean, a platform is a medium through which, users and sellers can interact, right? And obviously, Uber is a platform and Facebook is a platform and so forth. A lot of traditional companies are saying, we want to become a platform. We want to be a kind of an orchestrator of an ecosystem. But very few of them actually ending up succeeding in building that platform. And the reason for that is that very often, they're a little bit conflicted. They both want to be the platform, and they both want to be the provider of the service to that platform. So, you take Amazon Prime, Amazon Movies, and you take Netflix. Disney for many years, was the biggest, as it were, supplier to Netflix. Everyone wants the Disney movies. And actually, Netflix was the platform, Disney was the supplier, and Disney made more money than Netflix did, right? Disney has chosen to say, actually, we want to also be a platform there. But then suddenly that is a conflicted situation. I'm not saying Disney won't succeed, they will succeed. But, what a platform is meant to be is an almost deliberately kind of agnostic middleman that links up buyers and sellers. And of course, it's quite difficult for a traditional company selling a product or service to also be the platform on which that thing is sold. Ideally, you would choose to be a platform or a provider to a platform.
There's another question talking about blockchain at Bank of America.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little about the impact of blockchain and fintech and where's the opportunities for both, large established fintech, companies, but also the earlier stage ones?
So I have a heretical view on this, and some people are going to absolutely hate this. And so let's just see where we go.
Just an early warning to everybody.
Yes, a warning. I mean, we talk a lot about fintech, and we talk about how the banking industry is on the cusp of being completely revolutionized. And I can tell you as a fact that we had exactly these same conversations 20, 25 years ago when the internet first came along. And, right now today in Britain, it's the same retail banks as ever. In the US, it's still Citi and, Morgan and Chase and Bank of America. You know these better than I do. And so my theory on this is that all of these new technologies in banking are actually what we can call sustaining technologies. They are technologies which are going to make the existing banks stronger. We saw that with internet banking and telephone banking and mobile banking. We saw it with peer-to-peer lending or marketplace lending, as it's sometimes called. We are going to see it again with blockchain. So even though people can tout all these things as potentially disruptive, and we can look at the enormous valuations of these fintechs, there's lots of unicorn fintechs out there. In the vast majority of cases, these companies will not succeed. Some will be bought out by the big players. Some of them will succeed in niches. I mean, payments, for example, is actually an area where we are seeing some successful fintech companies. But actually, the demise of traditional banking and insurance companies is overstated. Now, I can't prove that I'm right, but I'm just learning the lessons of 20, 30 years of history, which is that those banks, because they're a regulated industry, because most of us can't imagine ever taking our money, our deposits out of our core bank because of all those sources of inertia, I actually think there is huge power in these traditional brands, and they won't be disintermediated or disrupted anytime soon.
And just a data point, what's of particular, and the case studies and research that I've found on Bank of America in particular is, if you think about, and Julian, I'd welcome your comments on this, in the US, when you buy a property, there's a deed. That deed has to be recorded with public records and a trail, a trusted trail of where that deed's been and who's owned it previously, and to make sure your property is not on some Indian burial ground that someone becomes really valuable. So that's one of the examples that I've seen.
No, so let me be clear on this, because you're absolutely right. So, we talk about Bitcoin because we see the price of Bitcoin, and it's, I don't know, $70,000 or something completely ridiculous. And we think that must be where the action is. But it's not. The action is exactly what you say it is. It is in the boring aspects of payments and settlements, the sort of the back office functions of banking, where the banks have to, talk to each other and settle claims and, worry about those sort of behind the scenes things. That is actually where the blockchain technology is likely to make a real impact. I actually believe that it will make an impact, but it's going to make an impact in the way that is completely invisible to everyday users. And it's not going to actually be the digital currency. It's going to be the boring settlements behind the scenes. So that's my view on it.
Yeah, and I believe it will become more prevalent in our lives, because again, when you go to get a passport, when you go get a driver's license, they're asking you for all kinds of other documentation to verify your identity. What if all of that, including my health records and other things, which opens up all kinds of privacy issues? What if that was based on a blockchain that said this is a 360-degree view of authentically who I am and what I'm about?
No, absolutely. And again, I think identity verification is a potentially very sensible use of the blockchain technology. And what we're going to start, we're already starting to see it. We're going to see companies working together in consortia to try to build, a sensible and essentially regulated system to make this work. Because if you think about it, the original blockchain was the libertarian's dream, right? Which is that we were going to somehow create a currency free from central bankers, free from regulation. And not surprisingly, the central banks say, we don't want that. This is not something we're ever going to really endorse. So that dream is kind of gone. And actually, we're now seeing a lot of big banks and regulators getting together to try to find these practical applications which work for everybody.
Sure. So as you and I discussed, curve benders are relationships that profoundly impact your future. Talk about the role of relationships in this reinvention of the enterprises.
So, and just be clear what you mean by relationships. You mean individual relationships?
Individual relationships, other corporate relationships. How do relationships, what do relationships and strategic ones come into play in any organization, any large enterprise reinventing itself?
So, there's a body of research. I won't get into the academic side of this, but it's very straightforward, which is we live in a world of intangible resources. Intangibles are trust, reputation, relationships, and so forth. And if you work, for example, in the world of professional services, almost the only thing you have is that set of relationships. How does McKinsey survive all these crises? It survives because, a bunch of very senior McKinsey partners have known the chief executive of this or that company for 20 years. And that is actually what they are selling. And so my point is a very simple one, which is that relationships transcend all of this conversation, right? The fact that I've worked with you for a few years means that I almost don't care what else is happening. That relationship is going to continue to survive through thick and thin, as long as I actually treat you well and you treat me well. So I think that all this talk of disruption, the professional services world is actually going to be the last to change. The world of tax and audit and law and professional advice, it is actually remarkable how little impact technology's had on any of these professions. So my advice to many companies is just keep on investing in those relationships, and gradually over the years, your brand will rise as a function of the quality of that set of relationships. So I don't know if that's what you were fishing for with the question, but that's my view.
No, and I've always believed that regardless of what you do, regardless of our products or services, we're all fundamentally in the relationship business. And if you double down on that, to reiterate your comment, it's amazing, economic cycles you can overcome because of the breadth and depth of those relationships, and they become really strategic in your ability to reinvent. So I'm gonna circle back to something you started that conversation with, which was, how many companies on the Fortune 500 didn't exist 25 years ago? I'm gonna ask you to look into your crystal ball. In the next decade, do you believe that 16 will increase or decrease?
So look, it will go up slowly. That's I would put good money on that. So in fact, I think, I did that analysis a year ago. I think that 16 is now 17 or 18, because I think Uber has now joined the list, for example. So what we're going to see is that every couple of years, we're going to see another one of these tech companies join the Fortune 500. Now, some of them will stay private, so they don't get onto the list. Some of them will bomb and will fall off the list. We've seen a couple of those. Some of them will merge with others. So that number is going to gradually creep up, but it's going to be incredibly slow. And remember, there are some sectors of the economy, healthcare, oil and gas and energy, industrial products, engineering, that have seen no change whatsoever. I mean, we don't see any of these new tech companies coming in and shaking up those industries. So you could probably take almost literally half of the GDP of a big country like the US and say, that part of the economy isn't going to change much. We might see one or two new ones coming in financial services, but for the most part, it's retail, it's tech, it's telecom, it's media. Those are the industries where we're going to start to see a few more new entrants. And by the way, I also did the same analysis for the global 500. It's not just a US phenomenon. In fact, if anything, the story is even more, the story is even more of inertia in the rest of the economy, because of course America does tend to have more creative destruction, more turbulence than Japan or Europe. So the only exception to my story is China, where obvious and for obvious reasons, right? You do absolutely see in China a decent chunk of companies, and I don't just mean Alibaba and Tencent. There's a few others coming behind them who are really starting to make a play, because China is such a sort of young country in terms of its really capitalist way of working.
I want to go to our audience for a question. It says, can you please elaborate on the identity use cases of blockchain?
The identity, I'm not sure I can actually. So particularly around the use of blockchain for identity verification. Is that the question?
Yeah, and I think is it to build on what I said, which is your driver's license is tied to your passport, ties to your mortgage, ties to, and it creates that 360-degree view.
I mean, look, I don't know the company. I actually don't know the companies who are at the heart of this. I simply have to pass on that. But what I can say is, just to build on what you said, let's be clear what the need is here, right? The blockchain is an indelible record of who you are and your history. And of course, identity is something that should be indelible. In other words, absolutely, I have the right to change my name, but nobody has the right to steal my name. And if we create a blockchain record with everybody's identities on it, what that means is that anybody can go in and look at that record to see the trail of who I am and who I used to be and everything like that. But nobody has the opportunity to go in and change that. So the whole point is we're trying to get rid of fraud and any sort of situation where there is the potential for fraud or the potential for somebody to come in and almost appropriate who I am or my money or whatever it is. Those are the situations where blockchain is potentially really valuable.
In our conversation around, and thank you to the audience for questions. I encourage you to jump in the last few minutes we have left. In our conversation around talent, you challenged our education system. You obviously work in higher ed.
Yeah, exactly.
Julian, how does higher ed needs to evolve to keep up with the demands of these companies that need to evolve?
So, I mean, I've got my kind of radical view, and then I've got my pragmatic view. And the radical view says we need to completely change everything. In other words, we spend much too much time teaching people the basics of, and in my case, at a business school, the basics of accounting and finance and marketing. And we don't give people enough license to think creatively and to figure out, how to really make a difference. We teach some behavioral stuff, but we don't actually give people the depth of insight into how they can lead and influence and change others. So that's my radical view. My pragmatic view is that we are operating with a business model which is absolutely tied to the needs of the employers. Our job is to try to train up the next generation of 29-year-olds who want to get jobs. It used to be banking, it's consulting, and now it's increasingly tech. It's Amazon and Google and so forth. And so we are to a large degree constrained by what those companies believe that they need. And of course, what those companies need is a little bit of what I just said, but it is also all of those basics as well. So we at London Business School, I mean, we're proactive, we're creative in terms of offering some of this new stuff, as are all of our competitors. But I do sometimes worry that we're a little bit shy about really giving the breadth of new offerings that the students really need. So I'm working on it, but it's a slow process.
Good. So I'm going to ask you about your next book. I know. Professors like you are passionate about research and staying relevant, are not going to stay, quiet long. Give us a glimpse into what are you most curious about? What could the next book be about?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the working title of the next book is indeed The Myths of Disruption: How Established Companies are responding to the digital age. So that is the piece that we kind of started this conversation off with. And that is a book I'm actually kind of writing right now. If there's a book beyond that, I want to look at the institutions of capitalism. I think that, and I'm not the first person to say this, but all of our institutions that are surrounding us, whether it's labor law, whether it's competition law or whatever, all of these institutions are just not fit for purpose anymore. They were all invented for the industrial age of 100 odd years ago. And, the system is falling apart around how we define workers, how we decide whether Facebook or Google is actually anti-competitive. We need to rethink that whole set of institutions to make sure capitalism works for the digital age.
For our audience, what's the best way for them to learn about you and your work?
Yep, you can go to julianbirkinshaw.com. That is literally my name.com, and I've got a website. It's not a very elaborate website, but it gives you access to some of my materials, and it gives you my email address and all of that sort of stuff. And you'd be most welcome to contact me. I mean, frankly, I'll give you my email. It's jbirkinshaw@london.edu. That's not a secret. It's very easy to find that. And I'm happy to listen to anybody's ideas or challenges or whatever.
For our audience, you've been listening to a Professor Julian Birkinshaw of the London Business School. Julian, thank you for the gift of your time, your insights, both on our podcast earlier today and also this live stream. I want to invite our audience to join us each week, each Tuesday at noon Eastern. Either I'll share insights from the next book, Curve Benders, or I'll have guests joining us, and would welcome you to continue the conversation. Julian will also visit the LinkedIn post where if you have additional questions or comments, would welcome that. Julian, thanks, and make it a great rest of your week.
Perfect. Thank you very much, David.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.